April 1942. A cold wind crawled across the North Pacific as heavy swells lifted the deck of the American carrier USS Hornet. The sky was almost black, the horizon barely visible, and the sea carried the silence of a world waiting for dawn. Yet on this night, something unprecedented was unfolding. Engines coughed to life one by one, their echo rolling through the darkness like distant thunder. Sailors shielded their eyes as brief flashes of orange flame cut across the deck. Then, in a moment few in naval history had ever witnessed, American aircraft began to move forward toward a takeoff run that led straight into the night. To Japanese picket ships scattered ahead, the sight appeared almost unreal. Silhouettes rising against the void, wheels lifting from wet steel, planes climbing without daylight, without visual bearings, without the traditional safety the Imperial Navy believed was essential. For a fleet trained to fight under the sun, this single moment felt like watching an enemy break the rules of nature itself. And it signaled a shift that Japan was not prepared to confront. The shock of this night would reach far beyond the Pacific waves. The spring of 1942 marked a turning point in the Pacific, but not one born from confidence. For the United States, the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor were defined by absence. The absence of battleships, the absence of territorial security, and the absence of certainty about how the war could be fought. Carriers, once considered auxiliary tools for scouting and limited strike missions, had abruptly become the centerpiece of American naval power. Yet even with this shift, no one in Washington or Pearl Harbor believed the U.S. Navy was ready for a long, grinding conflict against a nation as experienced in maritime warfare as Imperial Japan. Japan, by contrast, entered 1942 with momentum. Its navy had spent decades refining the art of carrier aviation. Its pilots were among the most skilled in the world. Its doctrine rested upon the assumption that air superiority, delivered through precision, discipline, and daylight coordination, was a decisive instrument of naval victory. From the attack on Pearl Harbor to the rapid capture of Southeast Asia, Japan demonstrated a mastery of combined sea and air operations that stunned much of the world. But hidden within this mastery was a fundamental constraint. Japanese naval doctrine was firmly rooted in conditions of clarity. Nearly every major component of Japan's carrier operations, takeoff procedures, landing systems, formation flying, and target approaches, relied on daylight visibility. Night flying, though practiced in limited form by certain land-based units, was never a significant part of the carrier program. The Imperial Navy believed darkness introduced too many uncontrollable risks: disorientation, deck accidents, collisions, and the catastrophic possibility of losing irreplaceable pilots. For a nation with limited industrial production compared to the United States, preserving aircrew was essential. American naval aviation, however, found itself in a very different position. The U.S. did not choose experimentation out of confidence. It was born from desperation. Pearl Harbor had forced American commanders to accept that traditional operations would not produce the surprise, shock, or psychological impact needed to disrupt Japan's momentum. To strike back quickly, the U.S. would need methods that Japanese planners did not anticipate and could not immediately counter. Night operations offered such a possibility, but the technical challenges were immense. Pilots needed to trust their instruments more than their eyes. Deck crews had to coordinate signals using minimal lighting to avoid detection. Navigation officers had to plot routes across thousands of miles of featureless ocean with no landmarks and no radio beacons. Every part of the system, from aircraft engines to deck arresting gear to altitude instruments, needed to operate perfectly in conditions where mistakes were unforgiving. By early 1942, the United States was conducting small-scale experiments. Training squadrons practiced limited after-dark sorties. Flight decks tested shielded lighting methods to maintain visibility without exposing the carrier's position. Admirals weighed the risks. Losing planes at night could cripple their limited carrier strength, but succeeding could introduce a shock effect that reached far beyond tactical results. Japanese military observers had no expectation that such operations would ever become feasible. To them, the idea of launching aircraft without the sun to guide pilots seemed reckless, even suicidal. Their assumptions were reinforced by experience. Nearly all major naval aviation victories in the early war had occurred under daylight skies, where precision could flourish. Yet in April 1942, the strategic environment changed dramatically. The U.S. had assembled a bold task force led by the carrier Hornet, carrying modified Army bombers and escorted by the veteran carrier Enterprise. The mission demanded secrecy, speed, and a level of operational flexibility that Japanese planners had not imagined possible. American commanders recognized that to get their aircraft into the air under such constraints, night and pre-dawn operations might be their only viable option. The night launch that stunned Japanese sailors did not emerge from sudden inspiration. It was the culmination of fear, necessity, and innovation. It was the product of a Navy forced to confront the question, how do you fight an enemy who believes they understand the limits of your capability? The answer would unfold in the following days, and it would begin with aircraft rising into the darkness, defying expectations on both sides of the Pacific. And to understand how this moment became so shocking, one must explore how the broader forces of war shaped it. The political pressure, the technological strain, and the human determination that converged in early 1942 now set the stage for the deeper backdrop of the operation. The strange and daring image of American aircraft lifting into the night did not emerge from improvisation alone. It was tied directly to a singular mission that the United States conceived in the early months of 1942, a mission intended not only to strike Japan, but to restore American morale and demonstrate that the Pacific was not a one-sided battlefield. That mission would become known as the Doolittle Raid, a bold operation requiring the impossible. Launching land-based B-25 Mitchell bombers from the deck of an aircraft carrier, something no Navy had ever attempted. And although the actual takeoff occurred in the dimness before dawn rather than total darkness, the preparation, danger, and near-night conditions surrounding the launch helped create the moment that stunned Japanese sailors who encountered the task force along its route. To make such an operation even remotely feasible, American planners had spent weeks refining every detail. The B-25s were stripped of non-essential equipment to lighten them. Additional fuel tanks were installed to stretch their range beyond what the aircraft was designed to achieve. Pilots practiced short-run takeoffs again and again, learning to coax heavy bombers into the air with only a few hundred feet of deck beneath them. Everything had to function with absolute precision because there was no margin for error. The U.S. Navy possessed only a handful of operational carriers in early 1942, and losing one in an accident would have had catastrophic strategic consequences. The Imperial Japanese Navy, confident in its surveillance network, did not anticipate that such a task force would approach its waters so early in the war. Japanese doctrine prioritized long-range reconnaissance, but its northern and eastern approaches, the direction from which the U.S. carriers advanced, were sparsely patrolled compared to those guarding more immediate threats in Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Japanese planners believed they would have sufficient warning before any American force ventured close enough to strike the homeland. This assumption created the conditions for surprise, and it intensified the shock that followed. Because when the Japanese picket boats first sighted the American carriers, they expected the familiar. They expected sleek naval fighters and dive bombers. They expected operations carefully synchronized with daylight. What they witnessed instead was a series of flight deck preparations that matched neither conventional tactics nor traditional naval aviation patterns. From the horizon, under weak gray light, they could make out silhouettes of aircraft that were unmistakably too large for a carrier deck. Worse yet, they saw the carriers performing actions that suggested a launch far earlier than any Japanese officer believed plausible. And when engines began roaring against the night-darkened sky, the realization spread quickly. The Americans were attempting a kind of operation Japan had never considered, a strike force extending its reach well beyond expected limits, supported by nighttime or near-nighttime takeoff conditions. Meanwhile, aboard the Hornet, flight crews were working in near blackness, guided by minimal deck lighting that preserved the carrier's concealment. Commanders understood that a full daylight launch risked immediate detection and interception. Every minute gained by operating under lower light conditions increased the task force's chance of survival. The decision was not made lightly. Launching large bombers in reduced visibility carried enormous risk. A misaligned wheel, a delayed throttle response, or a sudden swell could send an aircraft skidding into the ocean. But the stakes justified the attempt. By the time the first aircraft rolled forward, the Japanese picket ship Nidomaru had already sighted the task force. Its crew, stunned not only by the composition of the fleet, but also by its activity at such an unusual hour, raced to transmit warnings before American cruisers silenced the vessel's radios with gunfire. Yet even in their final transmissions, the sense of shock was clear. American carriers launching aircraft early, possible long-range raid. That combination of uncertainty and disbelief traveled quickly through Japanese channels. The Imperial Navy had not anticipated an American attack so soon, nor by such unconventional means, nor under lighting conditions they had not practiced against. This shock would echo through naval command structures as the attack unfolded. And now, with the raid set in motion, the focus shifts from the broad background to the deeper strategic and human perspectives that shaped this extraordinary moment. The night-shrouded preparations aboard the USS Hornet and the stunned reaction of Japanese sailors did not exist in isolation. This moment carried layers of meaning: tactical, human, psychological, each revealing why the sight of American aircraft lifting into the darkness was so deeply unsettling to the Imperial Navy. To understand the magnitude of that shock, we must examine the event from several critical angles. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, naval aviation was built upon predictability, not in the sense of complacency, but in the sense of refined mastery. Carrier operations followed scripts honed through decades of rigorous training. Aircraft launched into the wind at dawn, climbed into clear skies, and formed disciplined attack formations. Even in high-intensity battles, these patterns shaped the tempo of Japanese operations. Precision came from routine. Night launches disrupted that logic entirely. From the Japanese perspective, American willingness to launch aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness appeared tactically reckless. Navigation over open ocean without visual references was difficult even in daylight. At night, it bordered on impossible without advanced instrumentation and practiced crews. Japan believed the United States lacked both. Early war Japanese assessments consistently underestimated American naval aviation as structurally conservative and technologically inferior. Yet here the Americans were, pushing bombers, not fighters, toward the edge of a rolling carrier deck, and doing so amid the final remnants of night. This single act challenged Japanese assumptions in three key ways. It demonstrated operational flexibility Japan did not anticipate. To Japanese officers watching from picket ships, this operation showed that the U.S. Navy was willing to prioritize strategic impact over strict doctrinal safety. That willingness implied a capacity for innovation that Japanese planners had long believed was absent. It revealed a greater risk tolerance than Japan had expected. The Imperial Navy viewed its aviators as elite assets, difficult to replace, and carefully protected. The American decision to risk bombers and cruise in darkness indicated a mindset shaped by urgency and a belief that bold tactics were necessary. It suggested capabilities Japan had not yet fully understood. If the U.S. Navy could coordinate nighttime or near-nighttime launches, it raised questions about what other unconventional methods might soon appear. Questions that unsettled a command structure accustomed to predictable patterns. In tactical theory, surprise is often measured by deviation from expectation. On that early April morning, American carriers demonstrated that deviation with a clarity that Japanese sailors recognized instantly. While tactics shaped the overall mission, the human dimension shaped the moment itself. Launching an aircraft from a carrier deck in darkness required more than technical skill. It required profound trust. Trust between pilot and deck crew. Trust in instruments over intuition. Trust in the belief that the mission justified the extraordinary risk. For the bomber crews, the danger was immediate and visceral. The deck they taxied across was slick with salt spray, barely illuminated by shielded lamps designed to avoid detection. They could see only faint outlines of the ship's bow and nothing beyond it. Once airborne, they would lose sight of the carrier instantly, swallowed by the same darkness they had risen through. Every man involved in that launch felt the weight of those conditions. Pilots had to push their throttles to maximum power while counting on their aircraft to climb fast enough to avoid the waves below. A mechanical hesitation, even a momentary engine sputter, could mean disaster. Deck crews had to coordinate signals with gestures and lights that could not afford confusion. Officers supervising the launch understood that a single accident could cascade across the tightly packed deck. Yet they moved with precision, because they believed in the necessity of the mission. For many of the men aboard the Hornet, Pearl Harbor remained a vivid, unhealed memory. The shock of that attack had personal dimensions. Lost friends, damaged ships, a nation humiliated. The Doolittle raid represented not only a military operation, but a chance to strike a symbolic blow. That knowledge fueled their determination. This angle, the human resolve behind the technical achievement, is essential to understanding why the Japanese reaction carried more than tactical astonishment. The Imperial Navy watched a force willing to place its aviators in extraordinary danger for strategic effect. It suggested a shift in American psychology, a willingness to embrace audacity that would later define Pacific warfare. From the Japanese sailors witnessing the scene, the moment appeared almost surreal. Their training did not prepare them to interpret American night launch behavior. As the first aircraft lifted from the deck, Japanese observers struggled to categorize what they were seeing. Carrier doctrine in Japan held that darkness was an enemy of precision. Night operations required specialized equipment and elite crews. Assets Japan concentrated in land-based naval aviation, not carriers. The idea that the U.S. Navy would attempt an over-ocean launch of heavy bombers in low light conditions ran counter to every assumption embedded in Japanese naval thought. What Japanese sailors witnessed challenged three deep-seated beliefs: that American naval aviation was predictable and risk-averse, that large bombers could not be operated effectively from carriers, that night conditions inherently prevented complex flight operations. The reports transmitted that morning reflected a mix of confusion and alarm. Some observers insisted the planes must have been lightweight scouts. Others argued that no American carrier force would approach Japan so boldly. Yet all agreed on one point: the timing and method of the launch were unlike anything they had prepared to counter. This psychological disruption mattered. Surprise in war is not only a tactical event, it is an emotional one. When assumptions collapse, morale and cohesion falter. The night launch struck at the foundation of Japanese naval confidence, the belief that they understood the limits of American capability. And it was that disruption, as much as the physical aircraft rising into the dark, that set the stage for the operation's turning point. The night or near-night launch that shocked Japanese sailors was the surface of a deeper transformation within American naval aviation. To fully understand why this moment rippled through Japanese command structures, we must examine three additional angles: technology, leadership, and the broader strategic meaning. Each reveals why the sight of aircraft rising from an American carrier in darkness became a symbol of shifting power in the Pacific. Night operations in early World War II were shaped not by doctrine, but by engineering limitations. The Imperial Japanese Navy excelled in pilot training, formation flying, and offensive strike coordination, yet it lagged behind in the development of aircraft instrumentation suited for darkness. By contrast, American aviation, both naval and land-based, had invested more deeply in instrument flying, blind landing procedures, and navigational tools. This discrepancy played a critical role. American aircraft were equipped with more reliable artificial horizons, gyro compasses, and radio direction devices. While these systems were far from perfect, they offered pilots a fighting chance if visual references disappeared. Japanese carrier aircraft, whose pilots relied heavily on visual cues and tight formation discipline, lacked comparable redundancy. The U.S. Navy also benefited from experimentation in deck lighting. Shielded lamps, painted guidance lines, and procedures for minimal illumination were not standard, but they did exist in training manuals and had been tested in controlled conditions. Even though the Doolittle raid launched into the edges of dawn rather than full night, the crew had practiced enough low-light procedures to operate with relative confidence. Another critical factor was the aircraft type involved. B-25 bombers used in the raid had stronger landing gear, more stable handling characteristics, and more robust instrumentation than many naval aircraft of the era. Although never intended for carriers, these features allowed them to manage a short, low-visibility takeoff more reliably than Japan might have expected. To Japanese observers, many of whom knew their own navy lacked similar technological depth, this moment signaled something threatening. The United States possessed a level of aviation adaptability that Japan had not anticipated. In a naval warfare, where conditions often changed faster than doctrine could adapt, such adaptability was a decided advantage. Behind every bold wartime operation lies a chain of judgments shaped by risk, necessity, and intuition. The night launch was no different. It reflected the mindset of American commanders who understood that the early months of the Pacific War required actions outside the established playbook. Admiral William F. Halsey, commanding the task force that escorted Hornet, embodied this philosophy. Known for aggression and decisiveness, Halsey believed that offensive action was essential to regain the initiative lost at Pearl Harbor. He accepted high operational risk, trusting in the capabilities of his crews and the flexibility of American aviation. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, leading the bomber contingent, possessed a similar attitude. A pioneer in instrument flying and aviation experimentation, Doolittle had no hesitation embracing low-light operations if they increased the odds of mission success. His pilots were hand-selected not only for skill, but for the willingness to confront unprecedented challenges. Leadership on the carrier decks also played a crucial role. Air officers, deck crew chiefs, and navigators had to synchronize every step with precision, knowing that mistakes could cost lives and jeopardize the mission. Their confidence, forged through rigorous training, ensured that the operation proceeded smoothly even in the tension-filled moments before dawn. Japanese commanders, observing from afar through patchy intelligence reports, were startled by this demonstration of American resolve. To them, such bold decision-making suggested a strategic posture far more dangerous than the cautious, reactionary approach they had assumed the United States Navy would follow after Pearl Harbor. It hinted that America was not only capable of recovering quickly, but also of innovating faster than Japan expected. The leadership angle thus reveals a deeper truth. The night launch was not an accident of circumstance. It was the deliberate product of leaders willing to rewrite the rules under pressure. The shock felt by Japanese sailors reflected more than tactical surprise or human courage. It signaled a shift in the psychological terrain of the Pacific War. Japan began the conflict with a belief that its naval superiority in training, doctrine, and experience would secure rapid, decisive victories. The early months reinforced this view. Malaysia fell, the Philippines collapsed, Singapore surrendered, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet suffered devastation at Pearl Harbor. Japanese planners expected that the United States would respond cautiously, rebuilding slowly and avoiding high-risk operations. The Doolittle raid and the nighttime launch conditions that made it possible shattered this expectation. It demonstrated three strategic truths. The United States was willing to strike the Japanese homeland far earlier than anticipated. This forced Japan to reconsider its defensive posture and divert resources to homeland protection. American innovation would emerge faster than Japan had predicted. If bombers could be launched from a carrier at night, what other unconventional methods might the U.S. deploy? The psychological initiative was shifting. Japan, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, found itself reacting rather than shaping events. For sailors on the picket ships, the moment may have lasted only minutes, silhouettes rising from steel into darkness. But for Japanese Naval Command, those minutes carried strategic implications that would unfold across months and culminate in major shifts in war planning. The wider meaning was clear. The Pacific was no longer governed by Japan's assumptions. The Americans had introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty is the enemy of confidence in war. This realization set the stage for the decisive turning point that followed. The decisive moment of the operation began long before the first aircraft reached the edge of the Hornet's flight deck. It started in the pre-dawn stillness, when the task force pushed deeper into waters the Imperial Japanese Navy believed were safe from American intrusion. The sea that morning was unsettled, rising and falling in slow, rhythmic swells beneath a sky still thick with night. A thin gray line of dawn lay hidden below the horizon, but for the men aboard the carriers, darkness remained the dominant force. Shortly after 0300 hours, lookouts aboard the task force spotted distant silhouettes, small, persistent shapes drifting across the horizon. These were Japanese picket boats, part of a wide surveillance net Japan had placed roughly 600 to 700 miles east of its coastline. Their role was simple: detect any approaching enemy and alert the homeland. American commanders knew the risk of encountering these vessels, and yet they had hoped to avoid detection long enough to close the distance needed for the bomber's planned launch. But at approximately 0725 hours, the inevitable occurred. The picket boat Nito Maru sighted the task force. The small vessel transmitted reports before American cruisers opened fire. Though the picket ship was eventually disabled, the damage had been done. Japanese command now knew an American naval force was approaching, though they did not yet understand the nature or scale of the mission. Aboard the Hornet, the situation shifted instantly from controlled preparation to urgent execution. The original plan called for launching the bombers much closer to Japan, at around 400 miles from the coast. But with detection confirmed, the carriers were still more than 600 miles away, a distance at the edge of the bomber's maximum operational range. Waiting for daylight or closing the distance risked interception. The mission would either begin now or collapse entirely. Admiral Halsey gave the order: launch immediately. This command altered everything. At that moment, the sky remained in a deep early morning dimness, with the darkness only beginning to soften along the far edge of the ocean. The Hornet's deck crews raced to their positions. Men grabbed chocks, fuel lines, cables, and tie-downs in near blackness. Shielded lamps cast faint halos on the wet steel. Wind rolled across the deck at over 20 knots as the carrier turned to face it, maximizing lift for the heavy aircraft that were about to attempt something unprecedented. The B-25 Mitchell bombers, lined nose to tail, looked enormous on the deck. Their wings nearly brushed the island structure. Their tires rested only meters from the deck's forward edge. Each aircraft carried extra fuel tanks, making them heavier than any plane meant for this kind of takeoff. Yet they had no choice. They needed every drop for the long flight to Japan and the uncertain journey afterward. At 0820 hours, still under the lingering shadows of morning, the first bomber, flown by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle himself, prepared to launch. The wind strengthened as the Hornet advanced at full speed. The deck officer signaled with precise, deliberate motions. The engines roared, twin propellers slicing the cool air with a force that vibrated through the flight deck. For a moment, the bomber remained motionless, holding against the brakes. Then Doolittle released them. The aircraft surged forward. Japanese picket ships, still afloat in the area, saw the silhouette rise from the deck. A bomber, not a fighter, lifting into low light conditions with the ocean still a dim, shifting mass below. To them, the sight seemed unreal. The Americans were not waiting for full daylight. They were launching heavy, land-based bombers into the edge of night. As Doolittle's B-25 cleared the bow by mere meters, deck crews turned to the next aircraft. One by one, in a tightly choreographed sequence, the remaining 15 bombers rolled forward. Some struggled more than others, wheels lifting at the last possible moment as the deck pitched beneath them. The weight, the wind, and the dimness combined to create conditions far from ideal. Yet each bomber rose successfully, climbing slowly into the gray horizon and disappearing into the distance. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese picket vessels and at coastal command stations receiving fragmentary reports, confusion intensified. Observers reported heavy aircraft, something the Imperial Navy had not believed possible on a carrier. Others insisted the launch timing made no sense. Even if the Americans intended a strike, why begin so early and under such low light? The answer was clear only to the Americans: survival. Launching early increased the chance of avoiding interception. It gave the bombers the necessary range. It preserved the element of surprise. And in those moments on the flight deck, the roar of engines, the faint glow of deck lamps, the silhouettes rising against the still dark sky, the operation reached its decisive turning point. Because the instant the final bomber lifted from the Hornet, the United States had achieved what Japan believed impossible, projecting meaningful striking power across the Pacific under conditions the Imperial Navy considered too dangerous to attempt. This realization, already forming in Japanese reports, now set the stage for the unfolding consequences. As the last of the 16 B-25 bombers lifted from the Hornet's deck and banked toward the distant Japanese coast, the task force shifted rapidly into withdrawal. Admiral Halsey understood that remaining in the area, especially after detection, risked a confrontation with Japanese carrier groups whose whereabouts were not fully known. The Doolittle Raiders were now committed, alone in the sky, and the American fleet had fulfilled its role. What happened next would depend entirely on the aircraft that had risen into the dim light of morning. Meanwhile, the first Japanese reports traveled inland at fragmented intervals. Messages transmitted by the Nito Maru, before being silenced, mentioned American carriers, aircraft activity, and an uncertain number of planes moving west. But the messages lacked specifics. No clear assessment of aircraft type, no confirmation of objectives, no reliable estimate of distance. The Imperial Navy's response suffered from this ambiguity. Within the Japanese command structure, the early hours were marked by a chaotic blend of disbelief and urgency. Officers who read the first intercepted reports questioned whether American aircraft were truly en route to the homeland. Others debated whether the aircraft sighted were scouts, bombers, or misleading signals produced by the fog of war. But as more fragments arrived, a single concern began to dominate. The Americans might attempt a long-range strike. This possibility challenged fundamental assumptions of Japanese defense planning. Coastal cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka were not heavily shielded against aerial attack. The nation's defensive doctrine relied on the belief that an enemy would need to approach far closer, and that Japanese reconnaissance would provide early warning. The idea that carriers could launch heavy aircraft from hundreds of miles away unsettled even high-ranking officers. As the bombers approached the coastline, their crews encountered thickening cloud cover and intermittent bands of mist. They flew low to conserve fuel and remain undetected. Doolittle's aircraft, leading the formation, navigated directly toward Tokyo. Others diverged toward Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya. Though the actual bomb loads were small and the damage inflicted was limited, the psychological impact was enormous. At approximately 1,210 hours, the first bombs fell on Tokyo. The explosions rattled a population that had believed itself insulated from foreign attack. Civilians rushed into streets. Air raid sirens screamed across districts, and confusion spread as plumes of smoke began to rise. Japanese military officers quickly realized the implications. American aircraft were over the homeland. Carriers had launched them from beyond the expected defensive perimeter. 4 Japanese sailors and officers who had observed the early morning launches, the shock now gained clarity. The silhouettes rising from the Hornet under low light conditions had not been a feint, not a reconnaissance effort, but part of a coordinated strike that defied doctrinal expectations. As the raid progressed, Japanese anti-aircraft batteries returned fire, and defensive aircraft scrambled from nearby bases. Yet the American bombers flew quickly, made their drops, and turned southwest toward China, relying on speed and the element of surprise rather than direct combat. Their goal was not to destroy industrial capacity, but to send a message that each passing minute echoed louder across Japanese command channels. By early afternoon, Japanese leadership convened emergency meetings. Reports described multiple aircraft over major cities, each delivering a psychological blow far out of proportion to their explosive yield. A single question dominated the discussions. How had the Americans come so close without detection? That question triggered two immediate decisions. First, Japan ordered a massive expansion of its coastal reconnaissance network. Picket lines would be extended farther east, with more vessels and aircraft assigned to distant patrol routes. The belief that the Pacific Ocean served as a natural barrier had been shattered. Second, Japanese strategists recognized that the United States, if left unchecked, could mount further carrier-based strikes. This realization fed directly into the decision-making that would lead Japan toward the Battle of Midway, a gamble intended to eliminate the American carriers before they could deliver another shocking blow. But in that moment, as bombers raced away from the Japanese coast and the American fleet retreated into the vast Pacific, the immediate effect was psychological. The raid demonstrated that the war had entered a new phase, one in which the United States would challenge Japan's assumptions, redefine naval warfare, and force the Imperial Navy into a reactive posture. For the sailors who had witnessed the night launch, the events now unfolding made sense in retrospect. What they had seen was not a sign of carelessness or desperation, but part of a bold, calculated strategy. The Americans had used low-light conditions to extend their reach, protect their carriers, and preserve the element of surprise. As the day drew on, civilians returned to damaged neighborhoods. Officers traced flight paths, and naval analysts reconstructed the morning's events. The conclusion was inescapable. The Americans had accomplished something Japan believed impossible. They had reached across the Pacific, launched under darkness and distance, and struck the homeland. That realization, more than the physical damage, marked the turning point, because it forced Japan to confront a new reality. American carriers could threaten the empire itself. This new strategic truth now prepared the ground for the far-reaching consequences that would follow. In the hours following the Doolittle Raiders' withdrawal from Japanese airspace, shock gave way to analysis. Within military headquarters in Tokyo, officers sifted through incoming fragments of reports, witness accounts from civilians, anti-aircraft unit logs, radar sightings, and the final transmissions from coastal picket vessels. What emerged was both alarming and humiliating. American aircraft had not only reached the Japanese homeland, but had done so under conditions Japan had considered operationally impossible. The initial priority for the Imperial Japanese Navy was to determine the source of the attack. Early assumptions suggested land-based bombers from the Aleutians or China, both of which proved implausible when distances were calculated. Radar operators along the eastern coastline reported no large formations approaching from nearby airfields. Instead, the scattered sightings pointed to a direction few expected: the open Pacific. Within hours, Japan's Naval General Staff concluded that the aircraft must have been launched from carriers, and, more importantly, launched far earlier than any Japanese strategist had considered likely. The timing indicated that the Americans had released their aircraft at the limits of their operational range, which in turn meant the U.S. Navy had penetrated deep into waters Japan believed it controlled through reconnaissance. That realization brought immediate consequences. First, Japanese commanders recognized that their picket boat network had failed. Though the Nitomaru had transmitted crucial warnings, it had done so too late, and its lone position in a sparsely monitored sector highlighted a gap in Japan's early warning perimeter. In response, the Imperial Navy ordered an expansion of its reconnaissance system. more patrol boats, more aircraft, and extended surveillance lines stretching farther into the ocean. The belief that Japan could rely on a limited number of picket vessels evaporated overnight. Second, the raid exposed weaknesses in Japan's defensive doctrine. Until that moment, the Imperial Navy had assumed that the primary threat came from land-based American aircraft or naval forces attempting to engage at conventional distances. The idea of long-range bombers launching from a carrier, especially under low-light conditions, was not part of Japanese planning. This exposed a deeper doctrinal inflexibility. Japan had relied on predictable patterns of warfare, confident that its opponents would adhere to established norms. Now, those norms have been shattered. Third, the psychological effect on the Japanese population could not be ignored. News of the attack spread rapidly through Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. Although censorship minimized the extent of reported damage, civilians had seen the explosions, felt the concussions, and watched American aircraft fleeing over rooftops. For the first time in its modern history, Japan had come under direct attack from foreign power. This intrusion into the heart of the empire infused both fear and anger into public sentiment and placed additional pressure on military leadership to demonstrate control. Internally, however, the Navy felt something more complicated, a disruption of confidence. Japan's early victories, Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines, had fostered a belief in technological and doctrinal superiority. The empire appeared untouchable. The raid, though limited in destruction, challenged that belief at its core. If American carriers could approach undetected and launch aircraft under near-night conditions, what other operations might follow? This question struck hardest at senior strategists. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, recognized immediately that Japan's margin of advantage was narrowing. He understood that American industrial strength, once fully mobilized, would dwarf Japan's capacity. The Doolittle raid was not a decisive blow, but it was a warning, a demonstration of American adaptability and daring. Yamamoto concluded that the only way to secure Japan's future dominance was to destroy American carrier forces before they could grow. This conclusion accelerated the planning for a decisive engagement, an operation intended to lure the U.S. Navy into a trap and eliminate its remaining carriers in one overwhelming strike. That operation would take place at Midway. Thus, the aftermath of a night launch carried implications far beyond the immediate shock. It reshaped Japanese strategic thinking, altered defensive priorities, and set the empire on a path toward one of the most consequential battles in naval history. And with these shifts underway, the broader consequences of the raid, political, military, psychological, began to unfold across both nations. As Japanese commanders recalibrated their defensive posture and accelerated plans for a decisive naval confrontation, the United States began to absorb the effects of the raid from its own perspective. Though the Doolittle raiders faced immense danger on their escape toward China, with many crews crash landing or bailing out due to fuel shortages, the mission's strategic outcome exceeded expectations. For the American public, still reeling from months of defeats, the raid delivered a surge of morale unmatched by any previous wartime event. Newspapers across the country carried headlines declaring that U.S. forces had struck Tokyo, a symbolic act that resonated far beyond its physical impact. President Franklin D. Roosevelt capitalized on this moment to reinforce national unity. At a time when the Pacific outlook appeared uncertain, the raid demonstrated that American forces could penetrate the Japanese homeland and challenge the empire's sense of security. It did not turn the tide of the war directly, but it altered the emotional landscape. Americans now believed victory was possible, and that belief mattered profoundly for mobilization, recruitment, and sustained public support. Within the U.S. Navy, the raid revealed critical lessons. Commanders recognized the importance of integrating unconventional tactics into carrier operations. The use of low-light or near-night launch conditions, though risky, had proven strategically advantageous. The experience refined procedures for deck lighting, aircraft coordination, and instrument reliance. Innovations that would, in later years, feed into the development of more advanced night-flying doctrines. These improvements were incremental, but they planted seeds for a future in which U.S. carriers would operate with increasing flexibility. Perhaps more importantly, the raid reinforced the centrality of aircraft carriers to American strategy. Battleships, once the backbone of naval power, had already been exposed as vulnerable at Pearl Harbor. Now carriers, operating as mobile airfields capable of unpredictable and far-reaching strikes, became the chosen instruments of American resurgence. This shift accelerated resource allocation, training pipelines, and operational planning, ensuring that carrier forces would receive priority as the war intensified. Across the Pacific, Japan moved rapidly to address the raid's implications. The expansion of the picket line was only the beginning. Naval officers demanded greater coordination between the Navy and Army air services, improvements in radar deployment, and tighter integration of intelligence systems. Yet these adjustments masked a deeper issue. Japan was reacting, not shaping events. Each corrective measure acknowledged, implicitly, that American capability had been underestimated. The raid also pressured Japan's diplomatic environment. Leaders feared that the attack might encourage allied nations, especially China and the Soviet Union, to assume the United States was stronger than previously believed. Japanese propaganda minimized the damage, but military analysts could not ignore the fact that American aircraft had flown directly over Tokyo. The psychological effect was undeniable. For Admiral Yamamoto, the deeper meaning lay in timing. He understood that Japan's strategic advantage was temporary. If the U.S. continued to recover and innovate, Japan's window for delivering a decisive blow would close. Thus, the raid clarified his urgency. The American carriers had to be destroyed soon, decisively, and in one concentrated operation. The plan that emerged from this thinking would become one of the most ambitious operations in Japanese naval history, the attack on Midway. Yamamoto intended to draw out the American carriers, overwhelm them with superior numbers, and eliminate them before U.S. industry could build replacements. The shock of the Doolittle raid played a central role in convincing Japanese leadership that such a gamble was both necessary and justified. On the American side, the raid deepened strategic confidence. Though the material damage was limited, the psychological, political, and military effects resonated through the months leading to Midway. American commanders, now aware that bold action could disrupt Japanese planning, embraced a more aggressive posture. The Pacific theater was shifting, and both sides felt it. In essence, the night-shadowed launch from the Hornet triggered a chain reaction. Japan expanded defenses, altered reconnaissance doctrine, and committed to a high-risk engagement that would shape the war's future. The United States strengthened morale, refined carrier procedures, and gained a foothold in the psychological battle for initiative. The aftermath, though spread across oceans and command rooms, pointed toward a single conclusion. The Doolittle raid changed the Pacific War not through destruction, but through perception, by redefining what the Americans were willing to attempt. And with perceptions transformed, the stage was set for reflection on the deeper meaning of this moment in naval history. The night-shadowed launch of American aircraft in April 1942 stands as one of the most symbolic moments in naval history. Not because of the physical destruction that followed, but because of what it revealed about the nature of war, innovation, and human resolve. The faint glow of deck lamps, the roar of engines pushing heavy bombers into a dark horizon, and the startled eyes of Japanese sailors witnessing the impossible all marked a shift in the psychology of the Pacific conflict. In that brief window of time, the boundaries of what seemed feasible stretched, and a new understanding of naval warfare took shape. War often changes not through a single decisive battle, but through moments when assumptions collapse. For Japan, the belief that distance, doctrine, and predictable patterns of engagement would shield the homeland proved fragile. For the United States, the raid demonstrated that ingenuity and willingness to embrace uncertainty could compensate, at least temporarily, for material disadvantage. The Americans had taken a risk that defied their own pre-war doctrine, and in doing so, they signaled that the Pacific would no longer be governed by conventional thinking. The operation also underscored a deeper human truth: that courage is amplified by purpose. The crews who launched into the dimness before dawn did so with full knowledge of the dangers ahead, trusting their training, their instruments, and each other. Their actions carried immense personal cost, yet they formed a collective statement, a declaration that the United States would not be defined by the events of Pearl Harbor. In retrospect, the Japanese sailors who watched the silhouettes rise into the dark saw more than aircraft. They saw the emergence of an adversary willing to fight with imagination and determination. And history would show that those qualities, nurtured in moments of uncertainty, shaped the course of the Pacific War as powerfully as any battle or weapon. The night launch was a beginning, not an end. It marked the transition from shock to resilience, from doctrine to adaptation, and from early war imbalance to a conflict defined by innovation on both sides. In the vastness of the Pacific, under a sky still holding on to night, the future trajectory of the war quietly shifted.